Good evening, everybody who's here in person and online. We're going to be starting our Bible study today. We're going through the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, and we're going to finish it out today. We only really have one and a half scenes that we need to go through, so we're going to be able to dig in a good bit into each of them. So we finished through verse 21 last class, and if you want to see what all happened there, well, just go on our YouTube. It's there. Right now, we're going to start with verse 22. So any questions, comments, or concerns before we begin?
What chapter are we in?
14.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
You're okay.
So we're reading the Orthodox Study Bible because the Orthodox Study Bible, as far as I recall, uses the NKJV for the New Testament. So that's what I read from. Okay. So this was after, by the way, okay, context. Jesus just fed the 5,000. Jesus just fed the 5,000 in the wilderness. And we said there are a lot of really interesting parallels in that passage to what? Does anyone remember? What?
The Eucharist.
To the Eucharist? Yes, it was very much a Eucharistic passage. And then there's one other thing that I was even more excited about. Well, it's very much a Eucharistic passage, absolutely.
Counting the men of Israel for war.
Yeah, so it was the revelation at Sinai. So Jesus took the people out into the wilderness and he gave them 5 loaves to nourish them. The wilderness corresponds to the wilderness. And they went across the water. They went across the water into the wilderness. Jesus gave them 5 loaves and then they get counted. These are all things that happened in the Exodus. The Israelites pass out of the water, pass across the water. In this case, they walk through it. They end up in the desert. They encounter God on Mount Sinai, where he doesn't give them 5 loaves, he gives them 5 the 5 books of the law, the Torah. Not necessarily exactly in that way. He gives them the 10 commandments on the mountain, but it kind of the idea is he communicates the whole law to them at that moment. He also gives them manna in the desert, which is also like bread coming down from heaven. So that's analogous. These two symbols, the 5 books of the law and bread from heaven, are analogous to Jesus giving them the 5 loaves, and they're counted, and only the men are counted. Why? Because that was the question we asked, right? Why does it only say, now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men besides women and children? Well, I think a lot of us, and certainly me for the longest times, they were sexist back then. They just didn't really care about women. If that's what your assumption is, then that's all you're going to get out of that passage. But if you actually take it serious and be like, there must be something it's trying to communicate here, then you realize, then you can actually dig in and say, what was another time in the Bible where only men were counted, where counting happened and it was only men who were counted? It was the book of Numbers, when a census was taken of Israel, and only the adult men were counted because God was preparing an army for war to conquer. If you understand it through that lens, then you understand what Jesus was doing in the wilderness by feeding the 5,000. He was preparing an army for war. And that should give you some new way to understand what the church is. What do we do in the Eucharist? What happens when God feeds you from the 5 loaves here in church? Well, he's preparing you for war. He's setting you out as an army to battle. You're going to go out to conquer the world. That, by the way, and this links up so fascinatingly with so many other images in the Bible, because you guys maybe are familiar with the idea of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? John in the apocalypse, he sees, when the Lamb receives the 7 seals, the first 4 seals he opens, and each time a horseman comes out. The first of the horsemen of the apocalypse is a rider who comes out on a white horse, and he has a bow in his hand, and he's basically given a crown to conquer, I believe. That, by the ancient commentators, actually, by the church father commentators, was always read as the gospel going out through the apostles. The apocalypse began when the apostles were sent out to conquer the world. They got a bow to shoot people, to kill them and to make them alive. That's what a Christian is. You die, you get killed, you get conquered by the Bible, you get conquered by the Word of God, and then you become alive again. So this idea of warfare and the activity of the church very closely linked. And so if you just assumed in that passage that, they're just sexist, that's how they are, then you will get out, your interpretation of the Bible, you get out what you put in. But if you want to actually say maybe God is speaking in some way, maybe there's something deeper being communicated, then you'll be much more richly rewarded. So that's why it's another thing. I think the Bible is in many ways like a mirror, right? If you will it will reward you as much as you're willing to trust it. An interesting example, and I don't know why this came to my mind, but it's something that was on my mind. It's something that stuck with me. It was I was reading. This was like a decade ago, back when he was popular. But Bill Nye the Science Guy, you heard of him? And he started as a beloved children's guy, but then he became like kind of a political crusader. And I was reading a Time magazine interview with him like 10 years ago. For some reason, it stuck with me because one of the things it talks about is it talks about how when he was a teenager in college or something, he read the Bible twice, decided it was all made up, and then, gave up on it. And it's like, and I think that the idea of that, or at least what he was trying to communicate himself, was like, oh, he's very smart. He read it and he saw through it and he was able to discard it. But in actuality, I think that's very consistent with actually how the Bible works, which is that, first of all, the Bible is an extraordinarily complicated book. If you read through it without any kind of commentary or historical background, you're just not going to know what's going on. So that's why I kind of doubt he actually even did that, because you're just going to be confused. Like the first time I read the Bible is even as like a believing Christian, I was like, I can't make heads or tails of this thing, like Gaston and Beauty and the Beast, where he's like, there are no pictures here. That's the Bible's a really hard book, and if you go in reading with the assumption that it's just a bunch of myths from a primitive people, then you're going to get nothing out of it. But if you go in with faith and with humility, saying maybe when there's something in the Bible that doesn't make sense to me, maybe I'm the problem. The text is not the problem. Then if you go in with that humility, you'll get a lot more out of it, and you'll be able to see into some really deep stuff. So anyway, that's it. Okay, finally we can start reading, right? Why'd you guys delay me like that? Just I'm the problem. Okay, so verse 22. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now on the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It's a ghost." And they all cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus said to them, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Okay, we'll finish right there. So what do we have going on here? Like we said, Jesus is dismissing the crowds while he is sending the disciples away. Remember, we're on Lake Gennesaret. We're on the Sea of Galilee. It's that one little lake in the northern part of what's now Israel, Palestine. It's small. It's itty bitty. That's why the disciples and Jesus can go across it constantly. They go across it like multiple times throughout the Gospels. It's not very big. It's big enough, to drown in, to die in. But you can, at least on a clear day, I've been there. You can see the other side for the most part. It's far away, but you can see it. Anyway, so immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. This was actually really interesting because oftentimes, like, I've been reading the Greek more. I am a Greek speaker, but typically I just read in English because it's much easier for me. I have been making a point lately of going back and actually doing it in Greek, seeing if there's any difference. And 95% of the time, the English translation is just fine and there's no issue. But there's always these interesting little things. And by the way, this is an issue with the translation, but Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. That's a correct reading of it. If you're a Greek speaker though, and you hear the word inangizen, really it's like forced. He forced the disciples to get into the boat. He compelled them, is another translation other Bibles use, which I think is a little more of a faithful rendering. Again, to say he made his disciples get into the boat is not incorrect at all. It's just, I think it's not actually forceful as the word sounds to me. It's very interesting. And actually St. Jerome, commenting on this, picks up and says, this is a sign of true disciples of Jesus, is that you have to be forced to believe him. They had to be forced to leave him. It's very funny, but even these little details, they tell us something. But that sometimes Jesus does force his disciples to depart from him. And we'll get into what that means and why that is, but just make a note of that. And the context is that we see, you don't have to flip to it, but in John chapter 6, verse 14 and 15, it's a different telling of this same story. And the context was that the people were trying to seize Jesus by force and make him king. Because once they saw the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, it was pretty. I don't know. I guess it wowed a lot of them. It dazzled a lot of them. So they wanted to just proclaim him the Messiah and march on Jerusalem, raise an army, fight the Romans. That was their plan. So here's the Gospel of John is the last gospel of the four. And if once you get familiar with the Gospels, you realize, and this is well known, you realize John is always filling in details that the other three don't include. So that's why it was the last. It was always understood that John wrote his gospel, as many as several decades after the first evangelists wrote their gospels, and then he filled in a lot of the blanks. So just be aware that John captures some details, and then he leaves some things out that the other gospels include. Like I think, for example, the baptism of Jesus that John doesn't directly talk about. Because they already covered it, so there's no need. So it's just interesting. I'm just helping you get a little familiarity with the way the books of the Bible relate to each other. John is, kind of like in some ways like the most theologically deep of the Gospels, and it also fills in the details of the others. So why did Jesus make them go away if the other people are trying to take him by force? Actually, I don't know. That doesn't necessarily make sense. But maybe he's worried that the disciples will get swept up in it too, and to try to. And so he makes them go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. So he's doing something to dismiss the crowds. When he had sent the multitudes away, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. There's a lot going on there. One thing just to be attentive to is that mountains are really important in the Bible because they're places where encounters with God happen. The par excellence example actually is Eden. Believe it or not, if you closely read the text of Genesis doesn't explicitly say that Eden was up on a mountain in a high place, but it does say that there are 4 rivers that flowed from there. And, because ancient people are aware that gravity exists and works only in a certain way, they were able to infer that if there are 4 rivers flowing from Eden, then it may or may not be very steep, but it's elevated relative to the rest of its surroundings. So Eden was a high place. Mount Sinai obviously was a mountain. When Moses goes up and gets the law from God, he has to climb up a mountain and encounters him there. Elijah encounters God on Mount Carmel. The transfiguration of Jesus happens on Mount Tabor. I believe the ascension happens on the Mount of Olives. So mountains are places where God is encountered. And the temple, right? The temple is built on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. It's built on an elevated place. And before that, Jews worshipped God in high places. So mountains are and the symbolism should be obvious, right? Mountains are elevated. God is up, not in a literal physical sense, but our reality is symbolic of the spiritual reality. Heaven is up, hell is down. Not literally necessarily, but our spatial geography kind of maps on to spiritual reality, if that makes sense. Like they track with each other. Yes.
Mountains are also not typically easy to climb, especially to the top. The higher you get, the harder it is. So it's its own little form of sacrifice while you're going up there to meet God.
That's a really good point. Yeah, there has to be a process of ascent. In order to go up a mountain, you don't just do it willy-nilly, especially, if it's in the wilderness or whatever. That's a very good point. Mountains. And I think that would have been intuitively obvious, to ancient people. To us, we have hiking trails and funiculars that, take you to the top, or, very least, when I go to Greece, you can, in some place, you can go up on a donkey, like they'll do, but the ancient people were probably well aware of the challenge mountains posed.
This is what the people were thinking who built the Tower of Babel.
Brilliant. I was going to say that the Tower of Babel was an artificial mountain. It was a false mountain, basically. That's brilliant. Exactly a good point. And I was hoping to get there. Yes, it was a counterfeit. It was a counterfeit high place. That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to create kind of a new Eden for themselves, right? They lost the old world. The old world was destroyed in the flood, but they were trying to counterfeit God's holy mountain, and that's why he scattered them.
It happens a lot because there's in South Africa, South America, and then the pyramids in Egypt.
Yeah,
The Sphinx is all the high stuff.
yeah, I think there's something to that. I mean, that's the idea, right? You go in South America, the pyramids they build there look similar to Babylonian ziggurats in the Middle East, which look similar to structures they have in Southeast Asia, and it's at least perfectly reasonable to think that that's what the Tower of Babel looked like, and the people kind of retained that cultural memory or whatever, even though they were far removed from it, and that's why temples around the world look the way they do. And by the way, that should also be a sign that symbolically churches are mountains. Churches are mountains. You should make a symbolic connection with that, even though this church is not necessarily on any kind of physically elevated place. Churches are mountains because they're high places where God. Yes.
Another example I thought of was Abraham and Isaac when they encountered God, when Abraham was going to offer up Isaac.
He was going to take them up on Mount Moriah. Yeah, exactly. Which I think some people identify with Mount Zion, but it's not necessarily certain. That I'm fuzzy on. I can't remember. But it was on Mount Moriah that he offered. It was going to offer Isaac. That's a really fascinating story too.
And didn't Noah's Ark land on the mountain that made his first?
Yes, yes. Noah's Ark landed on the mountains of Ararat. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So again, mountains are super important. Anyway, so the fact. So I just anyway. I don't have a super specific point to make about that, but just notice when Jesus went up on a mountain by himself to pray, it's meaningful. It means something that he chose a mountain and not a cave, or didn't go down by the beach or something. He went up a mountain because mountains are symbolically meaningful places. Now, on a practical level, because there's so many, we can read on this deep symbological level all day long, and it's good and it's rich, but there's also practical dimensions, which is that, first of all, this is showing that Jesus is a man. All right. As God, as the second person of the Trinity, he's always united to the Father and the Spirit, but as a human being, he needs to recharge. And private prayer is necessary and normative. We are supposed to be engaging in private prayer, and that's where I think the by himself is so important. It is important to pray in the divine liturgy. It is important to gather for corporate worship. But if you are not also praying at home by yourself in a secluded place, and by the way, it's important to pray with your family too. If you have wife and kids, pray with them. Also pray by yourself. Something happens that's different. And if you have that experience, it's you can connect, you can interact with God in a way you can't when you're with other people, when you're by yourself. Yes.
The by yourself is also important because the further you get away from people, the less you really go on. Like, you can go on a hike by yourself, but you're going to get further if you go with other people with you. It's a human condition. We naturally do better with other humans, but when we're by ourselves, we tend to cripple ourselves and go, oh, well, I'm tired, so I'll just turn back around. Or, oh, I just want to do something else today. I'll just do something else. It's easier for us to change our minds on our own than it is in a group.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So yeah, but I think that's a good close reading of this, right? It's the dynamics of one person versus multiple people. Yeah.
And I think the awesome thing about like private prayer is, I guess, like praying with people and in liturgy is very good, but it's also like there's an element of like being around other people and like, that, like, I hope I'm not being weird, looking weird, or overdoing it or whatever. And so it's like when you're private or you're privately praying, it's like you can just pray yourself or pray with yourself and God, and do it in the most natural, genuine kind of way, I guess.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, because you have to be worried about if you're just extemporaneously praying in front of other people, because either you could make yourself feel awkward or you could show off. These are both possibilities, right? If you're just, but whereas you're private, it's really just you and God. There's no one to be. Yeah, and I think if you've ever experienced it, and by the way, I think it might take time to develop these experiences, so don't feel bad if you haven't, but there's a tremendous amount of relief, I think, that comes from really powerful prayer, just like that comes from your heart. When you really lay out your concerns to God, or you really, and it recharges your batteries. I really feel that way. So I think that's what Jesus is doing right here, right now. He's been swarmed by crowds. He's been teaching. He's been preaching. He's been distributing food. He needed to get away. So I think this is just a normative passage that it's, saying that like we should do that as well. All right, it's from the passage, it seems like he's praying up there for hours. Well, we might not be able to do that, but 10-15 minutes a day of just, talking to God from your heart to the best of your ability, because sometimes you try to talk and nothing comes out. To the best of your ability. Now, when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. So an interesting thing, reading the Greek, vasanizomenon by the waves. The boat was, I don't necessarily know that there's a meaning to this, but it like struck me again reading through the Greek. It literally says that the boat was tortured by the waves. The boat was tormented by the waves. I don't know if that's just how Greek expressed the idea of being tossed about by the waves, but I saw a meaning in that. I don't know exactly what it means, but I thought it was interesting.
It could be the creaking and moaning of the boat. It
Oh,
was
that's interesting.
so bad that the boat itself is creaking and moaning.
That's very interesting. And that's very like, I don't use the word primitive, but like that's how, more primitive people I say would like experience it, right? I mean, it sounds like the boat is alive and it's suffering. That's very interesting. It's very interesting. I mean, we're kind of removed from that way of thinking about the world, and it's a shame in some ways. But this is, there's meaning in this. Jesus forces the disciples to go away. As God, he knows what's going to happen. He knows he's putting them in a situation where they're very vulnerable. And they could get hurt. And I think this is just a reminder to us that this can and will be a part of our spiritual life sometime. It happened to St. Anthony, right? When he gets assaulted by all these demons one night, and the Lord appears to him later and heals his wounds. But he says, Lord, where were you? And the Lord said, I was standing right beside you, but I wanted you to fight for yourself so that I could reward you, so I could give you crowns. For your struggles. So God sometimes allows us to struggle. Not that God is ever truly absent. I want to underscore that, because I think some people misunderstand. God can't be absent. God is never unconcerned with you or your struggle, especially if you're a believer of him and a follower of him. But there are times when he maybe withdraws some of his power, withdraws some of his grace, and allows you just to go through it both to test you, but also to grow you, right? It's never, testing you is a form of just, cold calculating, like experimenting on you, like you're some kind of guinea pig. But if he tests you, it's only to grow you. It's only to strengthen you. Now, on the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. So this is, the famous, everyone, even if they've never read the Bible, knows that Jesus walked on the water at some point. This is it. This is when it happened. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out with fear. So and I think what's worth imagining, because sometimes we don't always visualize these as well as we can. It could be he's, the lake's not super tiny. It could be he's coming from quite a far distance, and it could be that they were tracking him for a little while. Like, what is going on? I mean, it's nighttime. Is he luminous? I don't know. Or is there maybe a full moon? How could they see him? Yes.
Storms also make everything dark and hard to see. When you have that much water pouring down, it impairs your vision. So it was possible that it was just raining so hard they could not make out who it was.
Interesting. So maybe it wasn't until he got close that they saw him. Okay. That's good to know. I've been boating a lot, but whenever there's a storm, we come back in. So I've never, yeah.
I think in some cases when Jesus was forcing his disciples away, I think, wouldn't that be considered like a sacrifice for their own safety if they were like to get drowned? If they would drown in the infested waters due to the stormy sea? Like, had they not gotten out of the boat, is it possible they could have all drowned from, hypothermia or loss of energy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I think there's a real sense in which they were in danger here. I think they, I mean, I guess maybe at the end of the day, we know that this is how the story ends. We know God was always going to swoop in and rescue them, but at least on a subjective level, they're very much in danger.
Not to mention, you don't know if the boat they were traveling in, you don't know what the weight capacity could have been in those years. Like if there was too much weight, it starts creating vibrations within the bottom of the and if your starboard on the side of the boat starts cracking, you're gonna have a lot of problems.
That's another good point. There's no this is not a modern industrial vehicle.
No.
This is what
Mostly made of, I think it was reeds, I believe. It's mostly made of reeds, I
I
think.
don't know what material it was, but
I
it was not made of steel.
It's not-
I think it's easy to read it and then know the outcome of the story.
Yeah,
When you're in your home with air conditioning,
right.
and you have a blanket over yourself. But then when you put yourself in their sandals,
Right.
obviously, even though you were with the Son of God, even after leaving him for a while, I mean, when the ship's tossing and turning, and then a metaphorical kraken wraps its tentacles around the boat, and you think you're gonna die. I mean,
Right.
it's fear.
Right. It's fear. And you might, a spiritual things might be 1,000 miles away right now. You have no, in desperate situations. And that's one of the things, one of the reasons we have to train ourselves to pray, because, when it comes down to animal fight or flight instinct, God might be the furthest thing from your mind, even if you're a sincere believer. Right. So that's why we have to train ourselves to call upon God, so that in that moment we can kind of gather that strength. Absolutely. So now in the fourth watch of the night, so that would have been between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. And that's noteworthy, Saint Jerome tells us, because that means they've likely been in this situation for hours. The text doesn't explicitly say that, but it sounds like it's quite likely that they've been struggling like this for a long time. And it's only towards the dawn that Jesus comes and rescues them. It's in St. Jerome, sees a tremendous symbolic value in that God, the night is darkest just before the dawn, kind of cliche thing, but maybe, but it's true. God comes and rescues them only in the nick of time, right? Only in the last minute. He probably let them endure a little bit, struggle. He probably wanted them to, have to fight, to have to, yeah.
This does bring back around to Nicholas's thing, because if they were fighting this for hours, your body loses a lot of heat when it's wet. You can't warm yourself up. Shivering does nothing. All of their clothes would have been soaked. And that boat, if it was already complaining at the beginning, it ain't holding up too good now.
Yeah. So it's true. So there's tremendous. They're physically exhausted, probably mentally exhausted, possibly freezing. The boat might be flying. I mean, they're in a bad situation. Things are really rough. And And Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And then when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. So I just want to underscore, this has come up, in many of these Bible studies, but, that they had a non-materialistic worldview. These were people who had no problem with, conceptually with the possibility that a ghost might come wandering in at one point. They did not live with our modern rationalistic assumptions about the way the world works. It was for them, it was very much a possibility. But it's scary. A ghost is a ghost is a ghost. What does it want? What does it do? We don't know. We don't know if it's benevolent or neutral or malevolent. But anyway, just one thing to say for the Jews of the time, but really for all ancient peoples, the seas were wild and untamed. We live in the modern world where we've conquered Earth to such a degree, like even what's the biggest way we travel long distance? Well, air travel, super safe. Even though driving is less safe, we don't really flinch about getting in these vehicles that go 70 miles an hour on a normal day. That's totally crazy. I mean, if you think about it, but for us, it's normal. The world just feels like a safe place. For these people, seas are very dangerous. Any time, and by the way, that's the biggest way you travel long distances in the ancient world. Even if you're going from one place to another that are connected by land. So even if you're going from Israel to somewhere in like Turkey, you're probably going to go by boat because it was faster. So they're used to sea journeys, and sea journeys are a lot less safe than any kind of travel we currently experience now. And there's very real possibility you'll get turned around, you'll get shipwrecked, you'll get attacked by pirates. That's another thing we just don't have. Historically, that's always been the case. Whether you're going by land or by sea or whatever, there've always been like people who might just rob you on the road. The fact that we don't really have that, I mean, obviously robberies and muggings, carjacking still exist in America, but it's mostly isolated to like certain concentrated places, right?
You actually still have pirates. The further south you get on boat, the more pirates you'll see,
Really?
especially in international waters.
Interesting. Well, I knew they had them in some places like Somalia, but yeah, fair enough.
So it's exactly what I was saying, because I mean, Somalia is probably one of the most infamous locations you would ever travel by vessel.
Hmm.
And if you ever watched the film Captain Phillips, it
Captain
was
Phillips, I was really about to
that
say
was hands down
Tom
one
Hanks,
of the,
famous Orthodox Christian.
that was hands down one of the scariest and most callous PTSD filled films you'd ever watch.
Really?
You
Is it
getting
really?
kidnapped at gunpoint, and then
Uh-huh.
you're blindfolded, you're tortured, and you get to see, you know, the assailants getting ambushed by Navy SEALs. It's just incredibly scary,
Hmm.
even in the real world.
Yeah. So even, and that's another good point, that even today, the seas, we don't have as much familiarity with it because most of us don't go on boats that often. And even if we do, we very, 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 very few of us have ever been on the open ocean. I've never been on the open ocean, even though I've boated my whole life. It is still a dangerous and scary place. And it's still, you are still very much, a victim of the elements. We were very interesting. We were with, I was at my theological school, the one I graduated from this past week, and meetings and stuff. We met with the new president, Father Michael Lambakis. He's great, but it's interesting. He was in the Navy before he became a priest, and he was telling us some stories about how he was on a destroyer. During it's a 600-foot boat, made of steel, right? And he said, well, sometimes when you're out there on the open ocean, you're getting tossed around like a canoe. I mean, even though we've conquered so much of the world with our technology, the sea is still kind of wild and powerful and untamed. And people still die at sea. Ships still, they're a lot safer than they've ever been, I'm sure, but they're still a very dangerous place. So just understand that when they're on the sea, they're not just going for a boating outing. At least in their minds, this is a lot more connected with the wild forces of nature, and even with demons and the devil. Yes.
A lot of people also weren't taught to swim, like at all. It was bad luck, and a lot of people wouldn't let you on their boats if you knew how to swim because of mutiny and things like that.
That's interesting.
Oh wow.
That's interesting.
So not only were they on this rickety old boat for hours, they probably didn't know how to swim either.
Well, we know that at least Peter knew how to swim, because there's an episode in after the resurrection, the Gospel of St. John, when Peter's stripped for work. They see Jesus on the shore. Peter puts on his clothes and jumps into the water and swims to shore. So there was some swimming, but yes, it's quite possible many of them were not swimming. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, said, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." This is interesting. First of all, because authentic encounters with God are often frightening. One of the most common Jesus says in the Gospels is, "Do not be afraid." Because if you're really encountering, this kind of divine supernatural power, that's a scary thing. I've never seen it myself. I assume seeing someone walking on the water in the middle of a storm is very weird and probably difficult to process. So authentic supernatural encounters with God often involve fear. So sometimes, we shouldn't expect that if and when God reveals himself to us, that it's going to be simple and comfortable and make a lot of sense. Actually, it could be strange, jarring, and maybe really shake us. Yeah.
I do have something to mention. Yeah. Whenever angels tell somebody, "Do not be afraid," usually it's prophets.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that Jesus uses "do not be afraid" in this context, because technically they aren't technically prophets. I don't think they count as prophets.
They're above prophets.
But yeah, they're above
According to
prophets,
Saint Paul.
and it's all of disciples.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's something analogous to what happens with the prophet. This is a theophany. That's a very interesting point. Yeah, it's not. And actually, we're gonna add to your point by saying, "It is I." It is I. In Greek, ego eimi. Ego eimi. That does literally just mean it's me. It's me. It's also the way the divine name is translated in Exodus. So when God reveals himself to Moses in the burning bush, and Moses asks for his name, God says to Moses, "You shall tell them I am sent you." That's the same as it's translated in the Septuagint. It's the exact same word, ego eimi. So Jesus is saying, I am. And this is more acute in John 18, verse 6. You don't have to flip to that. But it's when the soldiers are coming to arrest Jesus with Judas. And they say, are you Jesus of Nazareth? And he says, I am. He says this exact word, it is I. And what happens? Does anyone remember? They all fall down.
Oh, yeah.
They all fall down when he says, I am. So there is something very significant. And so this one phrase is not proof that Jesus is referring to himself as God, but I'm going to combine it with evidence from the rest of the passage to show that I think this is based on this and other evidence in this passage, I think this is a divine self-revelation. Jesus is labeling himself as God here. Yes.
Do you know any patristics who do that? Like connecting Exodus with this passage here?
Yeah, Jerome. So the commentary I was reading on this by Jerome, he says it straight out. Good question though. And probably more on the app that I use. I only have Jerome's commentary right now. I would guess there are others, but I don't know that for sure. So yes, it does just mean it is I. So it's possible to read this and say, Jesus is not calling himself God, but I think given the rest of the evidence, so he said, come. And when Peter had come out of the boat, he walked, and Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And now this is, if you know your Gospels, this is a pattern, right? Peter is an example of bold and brash and zealous faith. And that's a good thing, by the way. In general, he's a positive role model. He has one serious mistake, obviously, which is denying Jesus. But overall, we should read Peter as obviously as a positive figure, as someone to be, his example is to be followed. Yes.
Also, demons can't impersonate God, not to that level, I don't think. I think they're specifically said not to be able to. So he's also ensuring that couldn't be something wicked commanding him to come into the water.
Well, he's testing it. Yeah. So because demons can, at least in the ascetic tradition of Orthodoxy, demons can impersonate God, at least to a certain degree, in a certain way. How does that work? You say, how can the devil make himself look like Jesus? Well, to be fair, you've never seen Jesus. If the devil appears in a certain way and tells you it's me, Jesus, was like, you won't know the difference, right? Unless you're a grace-filled elder, in which case you can say, get away. But they can impersonate Jesus. But that's right. But it's right. Peter's showing a healthy skepticism. Lord, if it is you, he's not taking it at face value. And that's what happened with Mary too. When Gabriel appeared to her, he said that she's going to bear a son. She says, how can this be? Because that's where I do not know a man. She's testing him. She's saying, I don't know about you, buddy. And that's exactly what Eve failed to do. Eve did not test the serpent. She entered into dialogue with the serpent, but ultimately naively accepted what the serpent has to say. So the default position of Orthodoxy is skepticism, but not unbelief. Skepticism, but not unbelief. The saying among monastics of the Orthodox Church is, if something that appears to be supernatural happens to you, neither accept nor reject. We're not atheists. We don't say that ghosts and demons and angels can never appear. We believe, but that doesn't mean we just take everything as it seems. We have to be cautious. So I find myself as a priest, I'm more often debunking things than encouraging people. So, people who say religion is nothing but superstition, I think they don't have any real experience, because it's like, I'm actually fighting superstition constantly. I have people saying all the time, this happened to me. Is it demons? That happened to me. Was it a revelation? It's like, sometimes maybe, but very often I think we just get too ahead of ourselves. Yeah, of course, some revelations do happen, demons do happen, but oftentimes we're just overeager, right? Yes, you had something.
I kept coming to mind Saint Simeon the Stylite. A demon appeared to him. He's like, "Come out unto me!" Like it's like, "Oh, it's like Elijah, come with me on my chariot," and he's did the sign of the cross and immediately disappeared.
Yeah,
like, come off here, because he was just falling off and died. But
that's a great one. There's a lot of examples of the saints, and they're reverse examples too, of where a monk or a nun or something trusted an angel that appeared to them. It turned out to be a demon and deceived them in some serious way, usually tricking them into suicide in some form. So Peter, but anyway, so Peter shows a healthy skepticism. He doesn't accept, he doesn't reject, but he cautiously approaches it. He says, "If it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So Peter does not, and this is also something to be commended. I think Jerome pointed this out. Peter does not ask for a miracle for a miracle's sake. He does not say, Jesus, give me a miracle to show me that, well, he does say it in a sense to show me that you're God, but the miracle he asks for him is for me to come to you, for me to come to you. God only gives miracles to achieve a purpose, not just to show you a trick. He doesn't need to confirm anything to anyone. So Peter does not ask for a miracle for a miracle's sake, but he asks for a miracle as a means to Christ. And this is the proper context for miracles. There are a lot of, religious teachers. What's well known is like, Hindu yogis or whatever, in certain places in India who can do, apparently supernatural things. Like apparently, like, I don't know, I've heard of like stopping their own heart for a period of time or something like that. But oftentimes they're doing it just to show that they can do it. And that's something, maybe it's supernatural, maybe it's a trick. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? But I'm saying that wouldn't track as an authentic miracle, because there's never a point in time when Jesus does a miracle just to show that he can do it. If that makes sense. And in the lives of the saints, you see similar things. You see similar patterns. So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid and was beginning to sink. He cried out, Lord, saying, "Lord, save me." So Peter came out of the boat and he was walking on water. This reminds me of a specific doctrine that's very important for Orthodoxy. Can anybody think of what I'm saying? It's a little vague, but I just want to see, because specific doctrine is very important of Orthodoxy. Peter's walking on water. This, I believe, is an example of is a mini example of deification. The believer, by grace, becomes what Christ is by nature. Peter is, by being a disciple of Christ, becomes supernaturally transformed such that he can do the same things Christ does. That's what the experience of the saints is. That's why, Elder Ephraim could read people's thoughts. Well, that's because Christ, that's what Christ did. And Elder Ephraim was really close to Christ and had deep faith in Christ. So Christ imparted some of his grace, right, to him. Other saints, I can't think of any specific examples of saints in ancient or modern times walking on water in specific, but saints are known to heal. Saints are known to, produce various miracles that Jesus also did. And that's because, so this is an example of deification.
Is it that like people become like Christ through getting close to Christ and like therefore can do the things that he does, or that like they can kind of like conduit the power of Christ? Or is it
both and
Okay.
once the example a lot of the fathers use, and I think it's actually biblical originally, is it's like iron in a fire. By getting closer to a really, really super hot flame, a piece of metal also takes on some of the characteristics of that flame. It becomes red, it becomes glowing. The closer it is, so it's kind of like it becomes like a flame. Not that iron in a fire literally becomes a flame, just like human beings, they get really close to God. They don't become God, but they become extraordinarily God-like. And so, so they become a conduit, they become close, they take on some of the characteristics. Anastasia, you have your hand raised, you haven't said anything.
Yes, I was thinking Saint Mary of Egypt walked on water.
Oh, good point. Yes, she did. She crossed the Jordan River. Grace, you had a hand up?
Anastasia said literally the exact same thing we were going to say.
Oh, great. Okay. Yes, Esther?
Back before we had AC and temperature control, what people used to do was they would take big, heavy iron plates that usually had some kind of decorative design, and they put them behind their fire in their fireplace. And what this did is it reflected more heat than the fire would, because heat will rise, but it won't radiate out unless you have enough of it. So not only is the metal reflecting the fire, but it's taking on some of its nature.
That's good. Yeah, that's a good example of how human beings become with Christ. You become close to the front flame, and you can reflect the flame. People who are really holy, they become living images of God, and they bring other people to Christ just because people taste Christ a little bit in their presence. There's a couple things. So Peter, Another just side note that Jerome says that it's important for the ancient controversies was that Peter was walking confirms the non-illusory nature of Jesus's appearance. What do I mean by that? Jesus walks on water. Is it a hologram? Is it really happening? Is it just a projection of their minds? Well, you know, just seeing it, you can't necessarily tell one way or another. But if Peter gets out of the boat and can also walk, then it's like, okay, well, then there's probably substantial reality to what happened. Yes.
It was a Live the Saint video I watched, and I can't remember who it was. I can't find him. But I believe it was on Mount Athos. There was a hermit monk who was getting visited by someone. They're on two sides of a canyon, and then the monk just floats over. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was in the Lives of the Saints video.
I've heard of that happening with saints in many contexts. I heard someone who was present say that about Elder Ephraim. He got from one place to another on the Holy Mountain in a very, very short period of time, and I think it's not super uncommon that this sort of transportation or whatever, this mysterious transportation happens. Okay. Notice, by the way, just as a side detail, and this is for more of a practical concern for our spiritual lives, Jesus does not stop the storm. He allows it to continue while Peter is coming out. What we can tell from the rest of the passage is he could calm the waves, but he doesn't. So I think it relates to our personal struggles in the sense God does not always come into our lives by fixing everything for us. Sometimes he just gives us the grace to handle what's going on. Yes.
He still wasn't visible.
He still wasn't visible? In what sense?
They still couldn't see him, which is why he was questioning who he was. They still couldn't see who he was. They were close enough to hear him, but they weren't close enough to see him.
It says the disciples saw him walking on the sea in verse 26. So they clearly saw something, but yeah, it could be that they didn't see him clearly, or it was not, couldn't make out his features or whatever. But it is an interesting question. How did it sound like Jesus? I mean, this could be anybody strolling up to your boat in the middle of the ocean, Yes.
There was a gospel reading of Mark, if I remember correctly, where Jesus tells the storm, "Hush, be still," in one of the verses of Mark. I can't remember the chapter, but it was in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus had warned the storm to hush and be still.
Yeah, there's in one of the Gospels, it could well be Mark, Jesus commands the storm to be quiet. In this case, something similar happens, but Jesus doesn't directly address the storm. But yes. So verse 30, when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." So his faith, one of the things, his faith wavered when he took his eyes off Christ. And I've heard this, about people who experience something, maybe that appears supernatural. Sometimes, maybe you can accept it for a little, but then you look around, it's like, how can this be real? How this is so at odds with my experience of reality. It doesn't make any sense. But his faith wavered when he was looking at Christ. He was able to walk on the water, when that was his focus and his goal. And I think that is, we lose God's grace, we lose God's strength and his power to a certain degree when we start thinking of, all the obstacles in our life or all the tests and temptations, rather than just focusing on what is our objective here. So I think, it's a very, spiritually relevant to us. And beginning to sink, he cried out. And this is, I thought was really interesting. He began to sink. He didn't sink the whole time. It's not like he just hopped out of the boat and started and plummeted in the water. No, he walked for a little. You can start spiritually well and then begin to sink. It's possible, I've told people of a story. I won't say the whole thing, but my friend experienced a miracle through a priest who later ended up going bad. It can happen. People can be holy and can be genuinely holy, and then still not finish later. That's in a lot of the lives of the saints, unfortunately. And then, of course, there's it can come full circle. You have stories of, I think it was like Saint Nikitas of the Kiev caves, who becomes really holy. He gets deceived by the devil, but then ultimately repents and becomes as holy as he was before. So just the spiritual life isn't a static thing. It's not that saints come down from heaven gift wrapped and they're perfect all the time. Even in the most holy people, there's ebbs and flows, waxes and wanes. Marcus, yes.
We see in the divine letter that many fall off.
Yeah, and the icon of the ladder of divine ascent. Many people have fallen off, even though they've progressed far.
This is also very similar to the story of Adam and Eve. We all have our own little Adam and Eve sitting on our shoulder.
Yeah, yeah. Adam and Eve. I mean, they started in a situation of perfect grace, but they degenerated. Okay. So, and then he says, "Lord, save me," and that's beautiful. Just a beautiful expression. So I printed out. This is one of my favorite icons, but it's an icon of this image, and it says, "Lord, save me," and it's Peter falling in the waves, and then Jesus come walking, rescuing him on the water. But I very much felt like Peter in this image before, and so very, very much, just overwhelmed with whatever it is, whether it's circumstances of life or just negative thoughts or something. Like you can really feel like you're drowning. So you can pass it around, but I think it's a beautiful icon, and I just wanted to share that. Lord, save me, Kyrie eleison me. I think it's really beautiful. And remember, everything that's in the gospel like this, if someone prays in the Bible and that prayer gets answered, well, that means the Bible writer, the gospel writer, wrote it down so that you can say it too, right? If Peter says, Kyrie eleison, Lord, save me, and he gets saved, well, it's like, you should start saying, Lord, save me. So, or something similar, And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got in the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So, of you, "Oh, you of little faith, why have you doubt?" "Oh, you of little faith." In Greek, it's one word, oligopiste, like little faither. Little faith haver, imagine just like one compound word. That's what it is in Greece. Little faith, or why did you doubt? The literal Greek is hesitate. And I think, that's a very interesting way to like conceptualize doubt, because I think that is what doubt is for a lot of us. First of all, in order to have doubt, you need to have faith, right? If I can't doubt the existence of the flying spaghetti monster because I just don't believe in him. It's not like I can doubt what I don't believe in. You can only so doubt is a sign of faith. But it's it's a matter, it's hesitation. Do you trust God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength? Yes, you do get the yes out, but you pause for a minute and you pause. And I think all of us have a little bit of that in us, right? All of us have a certain degree of where, if someone asks you, do you trust Jesus? Do you believe in the Holy Trinity with all your heart? Yes. Even if it's just a half of a nano microsecond, I think it's a bit in all of us that we hesitate. And it's because we're frail, we're weak. But faith is something we cultivate, and we cultivate by engaging with God, spiritually through the church, through practicing the commandments of God. And then I think ultimately faith comes through experience. So in the Orthodox Church, we distinguish between faith by hearing, faith by seeing. Most of us are on the level, we all start on the level of faith by hearing, right? If you were raised in the faith, and I wasn't raised super religious, but I was raised to believe in God. My faith, began by hearing. Nobody showed me God. People told me, hey, there's this guy named God, and he created, and I started with that. And then as my life progresses, if I grow in faith, then I see more and more of God in my life, and that hesitation reduces more and more. It's not gone away fully, but it's a lot less than it used to be, and God willing will continue to get less. So that hesitation reduces by experience. But notice that Jesus is not upset about Peter's boldness, but about his doubt. This is an interesting subject, and especially for modern people, it's important that we don't condemn ourselves for our doubts. We don't condemn ourselves for unbelief, because we're living in an age when belief is harder than it's ever been. In what sense? In the sense that there are more forces acting against faith. There are more forces in our worlds to actively turn us away from faith than there ever have been. Doesn't mean they're real, doesn't mean they're legitimate, but they are acting. But the saints do say, like St. John of Kronstadt writes a whole lot about this, and he was a big miracle worker. He was extraordinarily popular in Russia in the 1900s about, the importance of, he was known because very many people were healed by his prayers very publicly, and, there's whole tons of accounts of it written, very interesting. But he would say, the only times people would get healed was when I felt within myself the full burning faith. And then when I couldn't get there, right? Maybe when I couldn't hype myself up enough, and then nothing, necessarily would happen. So I think it's very interesting. We have to take it seriously without, beating ourselves up too much. Yes.
And I think, like when Jesus went back to Nazareth,
Yeah.
like the local people he grew up with had this different idea or belief about him.
Yeah.
And therefore they couldn't receive the gifts because they didn't.
Says he did few miracles there because of their unbelief. Yeah, it's God's his ability in a certain sense. It's not because he can't act, but God in general chooses not to act when there's not much faith. Yeah.
I don't know if this is like 100%, but I like to think of it as like the phrase like takes two to tango.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you're not willing to be how you say you are, how you pray to be, then how can you receive assistance? Like if you're not also participating, I guess.
No, that's exactly the Orthodox concept has always been the word synergia, cooperation. Could God do everything without our consent? He could, but then why would he create us in his image? He created us in his image so that we could be like him, so we could cooperate with him. That's how he ordered the world. That's how he wants things to be. He wants to make a bunch of little gods who work with him instead of things that are just acted on by him. Yes, Anastasia.
I was just going to say the beginning of the hesitation in this entire story that's being told, from the very beginning of the story through the people on the boat all the way through Peter, is fear. When they allowed fear to come into their heart, it overtook them. It overtook what would be love in their heart.
That's a good point. That's a good point. The sort of like animal passions are the source of our doubt. Fear in this case, in other cases, it's pride. In other cases, it's something else. But it's a very good point. Yes.
How do you differentiate between the fear of God when it comes to love and wrath?
That's a really interesting question. And I think it's something that, how do you differentiate between the fear of God when it comes to love and wrath? I think the way the saints talk about it traditionally is that you actually move up through it. You start your life as a Christian only really fearing the wrath of God. You only just, you want to avoid hell. And that as you progress, the saints, the only thing they fear is losing the love of God. Saint Porphyrius has very moving words about that. Says, Lord, I don't care even if you send me to hell, as long as as long as it's your will I'm doing, because I just want to obey you in all things. Really, really beautiful. He loses even his fear of hell. Not that he actually expects to be sent to hell, but it's just an expression of how totally selfless his giving of himself to Christ becomes. So you start fearing God because of his wrath, and you get to a point where even you wouldn't even mind his wrath in a sense, because you love him and serve him so much. Again, not that he's going to be wrathful against you, but you kind of move past it in a sense. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Like you move from fear of losing yourself, right? From fear of losing yourself to fear of losing God, in a sense, like because initially, I guess it's all about you. Like when you get into the church, it's like, how can I fix myself? How can I fix my ways and all this and that? And then the deeper you go, it's how can I shift that?
How can I serve you? How can I please you? Yeah.
So it's like that shift, I guess.
I think it's very astute. Yeah, it's about moving away from the ego. That's our growth. And those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So this is interesting. Who was in the boat? The disciples, the apostles. What does that make the boat?
The church.
That makes the boat the church. Yeah, exactly. A lot of parallels are drawn. It's very good, and that's how you should be reading the Bible. Oh, it's in the notes for the study Bible. That's okay. That's good though, because it's how you should be learning to analyze the text, and that comes that connects it to the ark. I didn't even explore this when I was preparing my lesson today. I wouldn't have gotten us too deep in the weeds, but this is very much analogous to Noah's ark, right? God allows Noah to go out in the flood. The whole world is falling apart. There's total chaos. Creation is being unmade, basically. And then and Noah's allowed to go through that for a little while. And then it says, and God remembered Noah. And God remembered Noah. Not in the sense that he forgot about it. It's like, oh, wait, Noah. But it's like, God remembered Noah is that he brought Noah back to the forefront of his mind. And, when when God remembers, we live, because we're all kind of in a sense, we're all alive in the mind of God. That's why in the Orthodox Church, when someone dies, we say memory eternal. Which does not mean I will remember that. I want to remember them forever, but may God remember them forever. Right? It's what the thief says on the cross. Remember me when you come into your kingdom, because when God remembers, we live. So anyway, this was very much an ark passage. This was very much, it would be very fruitful for you to go home and study this on your own. Line this up to with Genesis 7 through 10 and see what parallels can I draw here. But I didn't do that, so I can't share it with you. But the ark is the church. The boat is the ark is the church. That's the place of safety in the middle of the storm. Now the church is always tossed about, always being shaken. I mean, we got problems left and right, and that's the most encouraging thing about reading church history is like, okay, everything was always bad. We think we have it bad. Like, it was the church is always, on the one hand, being battered by all of these forces, both from within and without. Whether it's the communists or the Turks or the heretics or the Emperor of Byzantium, the church is being assaulted in some way. But the church never ceases to exist, and the church never ceases to produce saints, even in the middle of all of this. So the church is the only safe place in the storm. So the first time, and this is the first, they worshipped him, they venerated him. Actually, the word, again, it actually has a broader meaning in the Bible, and it doesn't always refer to the worship that's given to God alone. But I think with the other evidence in the passage that I'm about to get to, and the statement "I am" from Jesus, this is all adding up to him being God. And truly, you are the Son of God. Yeah, so this is the first time Christ is confessed to be the Son of God by his disciples, at least in the Gospel of Matthew. Something about everything that's just happened tells them that Jesus is the Son of God. And when we say the Son of God, what do we mean? Well, what is my son? My son is, someone's son is like me. So humans give birth to humans. They don't give birth to puppies, right? If God has a son, that means that means it's another God, right? Not in the sense of they're separate by essence, but he's another one like himself. So if Jesus is the Son of God, that means he's in every way like God, or an image of God. Why do they get this out of this? Well, I'm going to just skip right to it because we're already over time, and but we're going to finish this out. If you have to leave, I understand. God bless you. But we still have a ton of fun stuff to cover. So buckle your seatbelts, boys and girls. It's basically obviously Jesus walking on the water. And by the way, now when they got in the boat, the wind ceased. God bless you, Roman. Have a good day. When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. So the storm. So Jesus walked on the water. He helped Peter walk on the water, and then the storm calmed when they all got in. These are all parts of this one miraculous manifestation, which is obviously a sign of great power, right? Obviously something supernatural is going on, and that in and of itself says there's something remarkable about Jesus. But I want to get to the point, I want to make the point that this is actually more specifically connecting Jesus to God than maybe we understand at first glance. What do I mean by that? That throughout the Bible, one of the attributes of God is that he basically exercises dominion over the waters, specifically the waters, and also the winds. But you have it right from Genesis 1:1, the beginning of the Bible. In the beginning, God made heaven and earth. The earth was invisible and unfinished, and darkness was over the deep, the deep being, the watery abyss. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light and it was good. Then God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the water, and let divide the water from the water." So the second thing he does is he separates the waters by the word of his command. He is exercising authority over the waters, and especially for ancient people, the waters might be personified as God. So that is, this is the supreme God exercising strength over the lesser gods. Yes.
Could the waters also be like a metaphor for chaos?
Yes.
And
yes.
God establishes like order within chaos, I guess.
Exactly. So yeah, the ancient peoples didn't have exactly maybe the same concept of chaos that we do. But like we said, for ancient peoples, and again for modern people who live near the oceans are very much untamed and wild. They're not something humans have control over. So they are emblematic of chaos. And the first, in one of God's attributes, the first thing he does in the Bible, one of the first things he does in the Bible, is exercise control over waters. He divides the water. Then in verse 9 he says, then God said, let the water be under heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. So he's making the water submit to his will, basically. It's brought out more acutely in Psalm 73, verses, 12 through 15. But God is our king before the ages. He worked salvation in the midst of the earth. You strengthened the sea by your power. You crushed the heads of dragons upon the water. You shattered the heads of the dragon. You gave him his food for the Ethiopian peoples. You broke apart fountains and torrents. So the image of this is God is overpowering the seas. He's overpowering the demons of when it says, you crush the heads of the dragons upon the water. The dragon is the serpent, is the devil, is water demons, not necessarily like sea monsters, like a giant squid or something. It's the spiritual forces of the water. God is crushing them and submitting and making them submit to his will. It happens especially in Psalm 103, which we always read in Vespers. The deep like a garment is his covering. The waters shall stand above the mountains. At your rebuke they shall flee. At the sound of their thunder, your thunder, they shall be afraid. The mountains rise up, the plains sink down to the place you appointed for them. You set a boundary, they shall not pass over, neither shall they return to cover the earth. So God's voice sounds, and the waters run away. The waters are afraid of him. He sets a boundary to them. He says, you will not pass. You will not. This is referring to the flood. I'll never cause a flood to cause. He is basically, for kind of lacking a better term, there's this whole idea of God just kind of like manhandling the waters, like totally just bringing them into submission. And that's why here's one more, I'll call it from Job, chapter 38, verses 8 through 11. This is God, kind of speaking to Job, proclaiming his own majesty. I shut up the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb. I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in mist. I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors. I said, this far you may come, but no further, and here your waves must stop. So specifically, control and power over the waters comes up again and again in the Old Testament as an attribute of God, the creator, and of course, where else do you see it? You see it in the parting of the Red Sea. You see it in the parting of the River Jordan. God again and again exercises his power over the waters, which are supposed to be emblematic of primordial chaos. So the very fact that Jesus not only did a miracle, and a miracle in and of itself is a miracle, but he did a miracle on waters. Remember, Jesus's disciples were Jews, were pious Jews. The Gospel of Matthew was written by a Jew for a Jewish Christian audience. If you were an ancient Jew, you've heard these stories. All of these associations are super clear. So why is he the Son of God? Oh, because he exercises dominion over the waters. It's super clear. Like 1 + 1 = 2. We who were not raised with this like really deep knowledge of the Torah or the Old Testament, we have to kind of be taught it. We have to relearn it. But for the audience of the ancient audience, this is obvious. There's a big, straightforward connection. So that's the evidence I'm talking about. Power over the waters is very emblematic of Yahweh, of God's power, and that's why you combine it with the fact that they worshipped him. Yeah, okay, that could also mean just venerate, not referring to God, but in the context of everything else, in the context of Jesus saying the divine name, Eloi me, I am, all of this evidence together makes this pretty clearly. Again, it's not one of the most straightforward, clear, obvious examples of Jesus being God himself, but the disciples clearly take it as that. That's why they call him the Son of God. So it's like if someone ever tells you, well, where's the Trinity? It's not in the Bible. It's all over the Bible. The word Trinity is not in the Bible, but Jesus is again and again revealing himself as having the same characteristics as Yahweh, the God of Israel, in the Old Testament. So yeah, Matthew's audience was Jewish Christians. They would have been aware of the associations. It would have been crystal clear to them. And that's why, again, the miracles Jesus does are significant. What specifically he chooses to do and not do matters. Okay, is that good for the? We're just have a like 2 or 3 more verses, and then we're going to close out the chapter. I'm sorry, we're 15 minutes over. What I like to usually do. Okay, but I want to finish the chapter. Okay, so now that episode's over. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret, and when the men of that place recognized him, they sent out into all that surrounding region and brought him all who were sick and begged him that they might only touch the hem of his garment, as many as touched it were made perfectly well. So they sent out into all that surrounding region. So this is the, first of all, this is another example. These people have faith by hearing. They've heard of Jesus's reputation. They don't know who he is, but once they hear about it, they start proclaiming the fact that he's here to all these people to come to him. And this is, an example for us. The proper response to Jesus's presence is to call others to him, other people in need of healing. This is another, example of, formal low-level evangelism. Doesn't mean you have to be standing out on the street corner handing out Bible tracts. Doesn't mean you need to beat your friends over the head with the Bible. But it does mean you have to be prepared to share your faith if you think there's someone who would be receptive to it, or who would just accept an invite to church or something like that. And that's all you have to do. Invite them to church. I'll do the rest. No, just kidding. But that is the easiest way to evangelize. I think. And of course, many people won't be receptive to it, or it won't be the right time. It's fine. But you have to be able to, call other people to it, because these people are not disciples. They're not apostles. They're just random, people. But they hear about Jesus, and they call other people to him. And they begged him that he might only touch the hem of his garment. And notice, first of all, this is humility, right? They're begging him, Lord, forgive me, I'm a sinner. I don't even, want to touch you yourself. Just give me the fringe of your garment. Just give me the hem of your garment. And that's another way you could translate it. The kraspelu is the fringe. Where in the Bible do we have fringes of garments?
It was on the high priest doing the Holy Holies.
It was, but actually, it's a good thing. It's actually in everyone's garments.
Yeah, it's on the four corners.
Exactly. So, this is in Numbers. So this is what I'm trying to say is this is a specific. When we hear "touch the hem of his garment," we think just like the edge. Like Jackson's T-shirt has an edge. There's an edge of my garment. If you, again, doing a search for this specific word in the Bible, and that's why it's very helpful to use the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, because you can match the words one to one. If you search where else does the specific Greek word show up in the Greek Old Testament, kraspedon, it takes you immediately to Numbers chapter 15, verse 37. So this is, God giving a number of commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai. Again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and tell them to make tassels for themselves on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a blue thread in the tassels of the corners. Then it shall be, you shall have the tassels, and you shall look upon these and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them. And you shall not turn aside after your minds and your eyes by which you prostitute yourselves, and may remember and do all my commandments and be holy for your God. I am the Lord your God, who brings out to you the land of Egypt, brings out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God." What he's referring to, if you've ever seen an Orthodox Jew in the modern day, is this, the tzitzit. The tzitzit. This was a commandment that you had to have certain tassels and fringes on your clothing. And what would they do? Were they just stylish? They just looked cool? No, it says that, and shall have these tassels, and you shall look upon these and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them. So the tzitzit were reminders of the commandments of God, that you were in this covenant relationship to God. You had to live obedient to God. You can share that or pass that around if you want. So it's not necessarily that they're asking to just touch the edge of Jesus' garment. They want to touch his tzitzit. And that should tell us something, because if we know our Bible super well, like these Jews did, like Matthew's audience did, then we know these tassels aren't just tassels, but they're reminders of the commandments of God. And it shows two things. One, that someone who is obedient to the commandments of God becomes a source of healing for others. But also it shows that one way we can read this is that the commandments of God are healing, are life-giving in and of themselves. If you touch them, if you grab them, if you take hold of them, you become healed yourself. That's why the people who touched the hem of his garment were healed. By the way, if you ever see when I'm doing the great entrance in the divine liturgy, some people touch the edge of my garment. That's what they're doing in imitation of the woman with the issue of blood, but the same thing. Now, where does this show up in Orthodoxy? all over the priestly garments, really. There are tassels on everything. We even put tassels on the altar. The chief example, I think, this is the epigonation. It's worn by some priests. So it was given to me when I was given the rank of a confessor, but it's worn by all bishops. And this is basically the most clear example. It's got 4 tassels, and it's got these 3 tassels, and then this, is like a tassel. This is what you wrap around yourself. But it just shows that the Old Testament commandments, they weren't just thrown in the trash. They were transformed and transferred. But all of the Old Testament is relevant to Orthodox Church worship. Again, we don't do it the exact same way as before, but it still has relevance. So yeah, there's something interesting about the tassels. And there's another one really interesting. This was in one of the things I've harped on again and again. You're probably sick of it. Is that one of the signs of the Messianic age was that a bunch of Gentiles were going to come and worship Yahweh, the God of Israel. Previously, Yahweh was just Israel's God, or primarily. There were other worshipers of Yahweh who weren't Israelites, but primarily he was Israel's God. But the prophets all over the place, in the major and the minor prophets, say, in the day of redemption, when the Messiah comes, Gentiles are going to start worshiping the God of Israel. So one example of that is here's Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23. This is a passage that's talking about the future restoration. This is a passage that's talking about the age of the coming Messiah. And it says, "Thus says the Lord Almighty, in those days, if 10 men from all the tongues of the nations stop you, even if they grab hold of the hem of a Jewish man, they will be saying, 'We will go to you, for we heard God is with you.'" So it's talking about in the new age, in the new age, for every one Jew, 10 Gentiles are going to grab onto the hem of his garment, literally his tzitzit. They're going to grab on those fringes of his garment, but instead of like hurting him, because they might be grabbing him to beat him up or something, they're going to say, "Take us to your God," and that's true, right? This is what happened. There are way more than 10 Gentiles now for every Jew who currently worships the God of Israel. Like worldwide, this happened. The Messianic age dawned, and this should be taken as evidence that Christ really was the fulfillment of these prophecies. These prophecies were said hundreds of years before Christ, and then they actually took place in reality. But in a figurative way, but also in a semi-literal way. People were literally coming up to Jesus, grabbing the tassels of his garments, and many of them were probably Gentiles. And that was a fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy. Very interesting stuff. And just one minor point you can make on that is that even the smallest amount of contact with God can potentially bring healing. Even just touching the hem of his garment, the very edge of what he's wearing, not even touching himself, can bring healing. Even the smallest prayer, or the weakest, most pathetic prayer uttered by the most unbelieving person can maybe, change their life or cause a miracle. So no, don't begrudge anyone even the smallest little bit of contact with God, because it could be just enough, to save their soul. So we should look at it metaphorically as well. Okay, we went over. Glory to God. Thank you for staying around. Lord, now let your servant depart in peace according to word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all people, light, revelation, and glory of your people Israel. Amen. Just remember, the more you put into the Bible, the more you put into studying Bible, the more you get out of it, the more it makes sense. The Bible rewards study of the Bible. It doesn't get more boring, it gets more interesting. Okay. Have a good day.